The classroom was quiet that morning, filled with the faint smell of chalk and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. The students had already left after music class, but one small figure stayed behind, a girl named Emily. She sat alone on the wooden piano bench, her legs barely reaching the floor. Her little fingers hovered above the keys as she took a deep breath. She wasn't supposed to be there anymore, but something inside her didn't want to stop playing. The music room always felt like a different world to her. It was the only place in school where she didn't feel invisible. The rest of the day, people laughed at her for being too quiet or too different. But here she could speak without words. Through sound and rhythm, each note she played made her heart lighter. Emily's fingers pressed gently on the piano keys, and a soft melody filled the room. The tune was slow and careful, like the way she walked through the hallways, afraid to disturb anyone. The sound floated in the air, dancing off the old posters of musical notes hanging crookedly on the wall. Outside, the afternoon sun came through the window and painted golden lines across the floor. She closed her eyes as she played, remembering the way her mother's hands had once guided hers. Her mom used to sit beside her at home, showing her where each key was, telling her that every note had a feeling. "Play what your heart says," her mom would whisper. Emily smiled softly at the memory, even though her eyes started to sting. Her mother had been gone for almost a year now, and this piano was the only way Emily still felt close to her. As she played, she didn't notice that the clock on the wall kept ticking toward the next class, or that her backpack still sat open beside the door. She just kept playing the same tune her mother loved, the one that always made her smile. The classroom felt alive again, like it had its own heartbeat following her rhythm. Suddenly, a sound from the hallway made her jump. Her fingers froze on the keys. Her heart began to race as she glanced toward the door. For a moment, everything was silent except the echo of the last note she had played. She waited, listening carefully, but when no one entered, she took another shaky breath and placed her fingers back on the piano. She wanted to finish the song this time. She needed to. It wasn't about showing off or breaking rules. It was about keeping a promise to her mother. To herself, she began again, slower this time, every note filled with emotion. The air felt heavy and peaceful all at once. Outside the window, a bird landed on the sill, tilting its head as if listening too. The hallway beyond the room had grown still. Only the hum of distant voices could be heard. It felt like the entire school had paused for her song. Emily didn't see the shadow moving under the door, didn't hear the faint clicking of heels approaching. She was lost in the melody. The piano spoke for her, telling stories she couldn't explain in words about love, loss, and the quiet bravery of a little girl trying to hold on to her mother's memory. Her small shoulders swayed slightly as she played, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel small or scared. She felt strong, like her mom was right there beside her again. Guiding her hands, the last note lingered in the air, floating longer than she expected. Then the door creaked open, and the sound of the hinges made her jump again. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. The light from the hallway cast a long shadow across the room. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know who it was yet, but her stomach twisted in fear. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to touch the piano after class. She could already imagine the words, "You're breaking the rules." Emily, echoing in her mind, her small hands hovered above the keys, uncertain whether to close the lid or keep still. The air around her felt heavy, filled with the faint vibration of the last note still hanging in the air. She swallowed hard, her pulse thumping in her ears. The sound of footsteps entered the room, slow and firm. Emily's eyes widened as she realized it was Mrs. Lewis, the music teacher, known for her sharp tone and strict rules. The woman's expression was unreadable, but her voice, when it came, was firm and cold. "Emily," she said, "you're not supposed to be here." The soft light that had filled the room now seemed to fade a little. Emily's heart sank, her fingers trembled on the piano keys, and she wished she could disappear. She opened her mouth to explain, but no words came. The classroom, which had just been alive with music and memories, suddenly felt like a cage, and yet in that silence, there was still a faint echo of the melody she had played, a gentle reminder that even small hearts can speak loudly when they have something worth saying. Mrs. Lewis stood by the piano, her sharp eyes fixed on Emily. The warmth that had filled the room moments ago vanished like smoke. Her lips pressed together in a hard line, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What are you doing here after class, Emily?" she demanded. Emily froze, her hand still hovering above the keys. She tried to speak, but her throat felt dry. I was just finishing the song," she whispered. Barely loud enough to hear, Mrs. Lewis stepped closer, her heels clicking on the floor. "That's not an excuse," she said. "Rules exist for a reason. You're supposed to leave when class ends, not sit here and play as if this is your personal concert hall." Her tone carried the same cold authority that made most students afraid to even look at her. Emily's shoulders hunched. She wasn't a troublemaker. She never talked back, never caused problems. But the piano, this was her comfort, her way of remembering her mom. She looked down at her fingers resting on the ivory keys, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to break any rules. I just wanted to finish what I started." Mrs. Lewis crossed her arms tightly. "You can finish it during class time," she said sharply. "Now pack your things and leave before I have to call the principal." The words hit like a cold wind. Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to say more, to explain how much this meant to her. But she could see there was no point. The teacher's mind was already made up. Slowly, she lifted the piano lid, trying to close it quietly. Her hands shook so much that it made a soft clunk when the lid met the wood. The sound echoed in the empty room, and Mrs. Lewis frowned. "Careful. That instrument is expensive," she snapped. Emily flinched and whispered an apology, her voice barely audible. Outside the classroom door, a few students passing by heard the commotion and peeked inside. They whispered to each other, stifling giggles. Emily could feel their eyes on her like sharp needles. She wanted to disappear. Her cheeks burned red with embarrassment. Mrs. Lewis noticed the students too. "Go on, nothing to see here," she barked, and the kids scattered down the hall laughing quietly. Emily's chest tightened. She blinked fast to keep tears from falling. She bent down to pick up her backpack from the floor, trying to keep her head low. Her fingers brushed against the old photo tucked inside the front pocket, a picture of her and her mother at the same piano, both smiling. Her throat ached. She wanted to be anywhere but here, but as she turned to leave, Mrs. Lewis's voice stopped her again. "You should spend less time daydreaming and more time studying," she said in a cold, matter-of-fact tone. "Music isn't going to help you in life." Something inside Emily shifted. The words stung deeper than any punishment for her. Music wasn't a hobby. It was her last connection to her mother. She clenched her small hands around the straps of her backpack, feeling anger and sadness swirl together inside her chest. Mrs. Lewis didn't notice the tears in the little girl's eyes. She turned away, picking up some papers from her desk, muttering under her breath about students who didn't follow rules. But just as Emily reached the doorway, a sound escaped the piano, a single trembling note. She hadn't meant to touch the keys again. Her hand had brushed one on accident. But the soft sound echoed beautifully in the still room. For some reason, Emily stopped walking. That sound, gentle and clear, felt alive. It reminded her of her mother's laughter, of warmth and love. She turned her head slightly and looked back at the piano. Her heart racing, Mrs. Lewis noticed and sighed in frustration. "Emily, I said leave," she snapped. But Emily didn't move. She sat down again, almost in a trance. Her fingers found the keys naturally, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Just one last song, Emily whispered under her breath, not to defy the teacher, but to honor her mother. Mrs. Lewis opened her mouth to scold her again, but then froze. The sound that filled the room this time wasn't the hesitant plucking of a beginner. It was something entirely different. The melody poured out like light through stained glass. Each note perfect, each chord rich and full of emotion. The air seemed to vibrate with feeling. The hallway outside grew silent as curious footsteps stopped. The laughter from moments ago faded, replaced by stillness. Even Mrs. Lewis, who had been angry seconds earlier, couldn't find her words. She stood completely still, her eyes widening as the child played. Emily's small frame moved gently with the rhythm, her face calm now, lost in the music. The sadness, the love, the longing, all of it flowed through her fingertips, filling the classroom with something far more powerful than words. For the first time, Mrs. Lewis didn't see a rule breaker. She saw a child carrying something beautiful and heavy inside her heart, something that even adults couldn't understand. When the final note lingered, the air seemed to hold its breath. Emily looked up slowly, her cheeks wet with quiet tears. Mrs. Lewis didn't speak. Couldn't speak. The classroom, which had been filled with anger moments ago, now felt sacred. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, footsteps echoed again in the hallway, slow, steady, and approaching, and that's when the door opened, revealing a tall figure standing in the doorway, someone who had heard every note, and whose presence would change everything that came after. The heavy wooden door creaked wider, and the sunlight from the hallway spilled into the room. Emily stopped playing mid-note, her fingers still pressed against the cool piano keys. Her heart pounded in her chest and she quickly turned her head, expecting more scolding. But instead she saw the tall figure of Principal Harris standing there. He didn't speak right away, he just stood silently, his eyes fixed on Emily behind his glasses. His expression was unreadable, part surprise, part disbelief. It was clear that he had heard enough of the song to be moved. The air in the room was thick with the echo of the last note that still hung. Trembling between them, Mrs. Lewis straightened immediately. Her face turned red as she stammered, "Oh, Principal Harris, I was just about to handle this." The student was disobeying class rules and staying after hours. Her voice tried to sound calm, but there was a nervous edge to it. Principal Harris didn't respond to her right away. Instead, he took a slow step inside the room, the sound of his shoes soft against the tiled floor. His eyes didn't leave Emily. She sat frozen at the piano bench, her small hand still resting lightly on the keys. "You were playing?" he finally asked, his tone calm but curious. Emily hesitated. Yes, sir," she whispered. Her voice shook a little. She wasn't sure if she was in trouble or not. Mrs. Lewis jumped in quickly. "She was not authorized to be here, sir. I've told her many times that the music room is to remain closed after class. But she—" "Enough, Mrs. Lewis," Principal Harris interrupted gently. His voice wasn't harsh, but it carried quiet authority. The teacher blinked, taken aback. He turned back to Emily, his gaze softening. "Play something again," he said. Emily's mouth fell open slightly. "Now?" she asked, almost afraid to believe him. "Yes, please," he said, folding his hands behind his back. "I'd like to hear what you were just playing." Mrs. Lewis looked shocked. "Sir, surely we shouldn't—" But he simply lifted his hand to stop her. His eyes stayed on the little girl at the piano. Emily hesitated, her pulse racing. She wasn't used to people wanting to hear her play. Every other time she touched the piano outside of class, it ended in scolding. But something in the principal's eyes told her it was okay. Her fingers trembled as she lifted them over the keys again. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Then softly, she began to play. The first notes were shaky, almost uncertain. But as the melody unfolded, confidence replaced fear. Her touch grew surer, the rhythm smoother. The music filled the space again, echoing off the walls, warm and full of feeling. Principal Harris's expression changed slowly. His eyes softened, and he took a deep breath as though the music had reached deep inside him. Mrs. Lewis stood off to the side, her arms falling to her sides, the irritation fading from her face. The song Emily played was Clair de Lune, a piece her mother had taught her when she was just 5. Her mother used to say that the song reminded her of moonlight dancing on water. And now, as Emily played, the light from the window shimmered across the piano, making it look like rippling silver. Her hands glided smoothly across the keys, and the melody rose. Each note told a story of love and loss, of a little girl holding on to her mother's memory through music. By the time she reached the middle of the song, even the air felt different, calmer, softer. Outside the classroom, more students had gathered, drawn by the sound. They whispered among themselves, peeking in through the glass. None of them laughed this time. The sound was too beautiful, too honest. When the last note faded into silence, no one moved. Principal Harris stood completely still, his eyes glistening slightly behind his glasses. He finally exhaled and said softly, "That was incredible." Emily lowered her head, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she murmured. He stepped closer, resting one hand gently on the edge of the piano. "Who taught you to play like that?" he asked. Emily looked up at him, her eyes big and full of sadness. "My mom did," she whispered. "She used to teach me every evening. But her voice broke slightly and she looked away. She passed away last year." A deep silence filled the room. The principal's expression softened completely. The sternness melted away, replaced by quiet understanding. He nodded slowly. "I see," he said. "She must have been very proud of you." Mrs. Lewis bit her lip. guilt creeping over her face she hadn't known, hadn't even bothered to ask. Suddenly, her anger felt small and cruel in the face of the child's loss. Principal Harris turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Lewis, sometimes rules are not as important as understanding," he said. "This girl isn't breaking the spirit of music, she's living it." Emily blinked in surprise. She had never heard anyone defend her before. Her chest tightened with emotion. Principal Harris crouched slightly so he was at her eye level. "You have a gift, Emily," he said kindly. "Would you play that same song again tomorrow morning during assembly?" Her eyes widened. "In front of everyone?" He smiled softly. "Yes, I think everyone in this school should hear what I just did." Emily hesitated, but then a small smile began to form. It was the first real smile she'd had in months. Mrs. Lewis stood quietly, staring at the little girl she had just scolded. The echo of the song still lingered in her mind, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a teacher correcting a student. She felt like a student herself, learning what real music meant. The bell rang in the distance, signaling the end of the day, but no one in that room moved. The melody still played silently in their minds, a reminder that sometimes one small act of courage can make the whole world stop and listen. The next morning dawned bright and cold, a thin layer of frost glimmering on the windows of Willow Creek Elementary. Emily woke earlier than usual, her stomach tight with nerves. Today wasn't just another school day. Today, she would play in front of everyone, teachers, students, and the principal himself. She dressed quietly, her fingers fumbling as she buttoned her faded blue sweater. Her grandmother, who had been caring for her since her mother passed, stood in the kitchen making oatmeal. "You look pale, sweetheart," she said softly. "You don't have to do this if you're scared." Emily shook her head, clutching her backpack straps. "I want to," she said, her voice steady but small. Her grandmother gave her a gentle smile. "Your mama would be proud," she whispered. That single sentence made Emily's chest tighten, but it also gave her strength. By the time she arrived at school, the hallways buzzed with morning chatter. Students whispered excitedly about the girl who played the piano yesterday. Emily could feel the eyes on her as she walked past. Some kids smiled. Others just stared curiously. She wasn't used to the attention. It made her heart race, but this time, not entirely from fear. In the office, Principal Harris was setting up a small stage in the auditorium with a portable piano. His sleeves were rolled up, and he looked surprisingly hands-on for someone usually behind a desk. When he saw Emily at the door, he gave her a reassuring nod. "Good morning, Emily," he said warmly. "Everything's ready. You'll do great." Mrs. Lewis stood beside him, looking uneasy. She had spent the entire night replaying yesterday's moment in her head. The music, the child's trembling hands, her own harsh words, now seeing Emily again. Guilt sat heavy in her chest. "Emily," she said softly, I'm sorry about how I spoke to you yesterday." Emily blinked, surprised. She wasn't expecting that. "It's okay, ma'am," she said quickly. Her voice carried no anger, only kindness, which made the teacher feel even worse. As the first bell rang, students began filing into the auditorium, chatter bouncing off the walls. Some carried notebooks. Others just came to see what the fuss was about. A few teachers whispered to each other, skeptical that this small, shy girl could do anything special. Emily stood behind the curtain. Clutching her hands tightly, her palms were sweating. Her heart pounded so loudly it felt like a drum in her chest. She peeked out and saw rows upon rows of faces staring at the empty stage. The sight made her legs shake. Principal Harris leaned down beside her, his voice calm and kind. "Do you remember how you played yesterday?" he asked. She nodded nervously. "Then do exactly that. Forget the crowd. Just play like you're back in the music room, with your mom beside you." Those words hit deep. Emily took a shaky breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and imagined that small classroom again, the smell of chalk, the warmth of the sunlight, the soft sound of her mother's laughter. When she opened her eyes, she felt ready. The curtains parted slowly. A hush fell over the crowd. Emily stepped forward, her shoes making tiny sounds on the wooden floor. The piano gleamed under the soft lights. Waiting for her, she sat down, her feet barely touching the ground. The microphone picked up the soft rustle of her breath. Principal Harris gave her an encouraging nod from the side, and then the room went silent. Her fingers touched the keys, cold and smooth. For a brief second, she hesitated. The silence was so deep that she could hear someone whisper in the back row. Then she pressed the first note, and the world changed. The sound was gentle at first, like morning dew. Then it grew, swelling through the hall. The melody floated across the room, weaving through the crowd, wrapping around every listener. It wasn't just music, it was emotion turned into sound. Even the students who usually joked during assembly sat frozen. Their chatter vanished, replaced by wide-eyed silence. Some teachers wiped their eyes quietly. The janitor in the back stopped sweeping, resting his hands on the broom handle. Every note told a story. The pain of losing someone. The courage of holding on in the hope that maybe somehow, love never truly disappears. Emily didn't just play. She felt every sound. Her small frame swayed with the rhythm, her expression calm and focused. When she reached the final few notes, a tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't stop. The melody rose and fell like a heartbeat. Like breathing, like life itself, then silence. The final chord lingered in the air, and time seemed to stop. For a moment, no one moved. The entire hall held its breath. Then Principal Harris began to clap, slowly at first, then others joined. The applause grew louder and louder until the walls trembled with it. Emily looked up, startled. Her cheeks flushed pink. She'd never seen so many people clapping for her. Students stood on their feet cheering. Some even whistled. Mrs. Lewis had both hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Principal Harris walked up to the stage, his eyes shining. "That," he said into the microphone, "is what real courage sounds like." The crowd roared with approval. Emily smiled shyly and gave a small bow. For the first time in her young life, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel small. She felt like her mother's voice was somewhere in the music, whispering, "You did it, sweetheart." As the students filed out, still talking about what they'd heard, Mrs. Lewis approached her once more. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling, "you reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place." Emily smiled softly, clutching the edge of the piano. "I just wanted to play," she said simply, and as the principal turned off the stage lights, he knew one thing for certain. This little girl's song had changed the whole school forever. The days after the assembly felt different at Willow Creek Elementary. It was as if something bright and warm had settled over the school. Everywhere Emily went, people whispered her name, not in mockery or pity this time, but in admiration. "That's the girl who played the piano," they'd say, and smiles would follow her down the hall. But for Emily, fame wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that, for the first time since her mother's passing, she felt seen. She no longer felt like the quiet shadow sitting alone at lunch. She felt like she belonged. Principal Harris had made a promise that morning after her performance. "You've reminded us of something important," he had told her. "Music isn't just sound, it's soul, and from now on, we're going to make sure every student has a chance to share theirs." And he meant it. Within a week, the principal announced the start of a new music club. Students who love to play instruments, sing, or even write songs could come after school and express themselves freely. No tests, no grades, just music. Emily's name was at the top of the list. Mrs. Lewis was the one assigned to supervise the club. She wasn't thrilled at first. Her strict sense of order clashed with the chaos of creative kids. But something about Emily's song had changed her too. She saw now how rules could sometimes silence what was meant to shine. The first day of the club, Emily walked into the familiar music room. Her heart fluttered when she saw other students already there, some holding violins, others whispering shyly about singing. The room, once empty and lonely, now buzzed with excitement. Mrs. Lewis stood by the piano, her tone softer than ever before. "All right, everyone," she said with a faint smile. "This is your space. I want you to make music, not noise. And most importantly, enjoy it." Emily sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. She felt nervous again, but this time it was a good kind of nervous. The kind that comes before something wonderful. A few students gathered around her asking, "Can you teach us what you played during assembly?" Her eyes widened. "You want me to teach you?" she asked. "Of course," said a boy with messy brown hair. It was amazing. Emily smiled shyly, and soon she began showing them the basic notes. Her hands moved gently, guiding theirs just like her mother once did for her. Each time someone got a note right, she beamed, proud and patient. The music room filled with laughter and clumsy chords, but it was beautiful chaos from the doorway. Mrs. Lewis watched silently. The sight made her chest tighten. This was what she had forgotten. That teaching wasn't about control. It was about guiding hearts. Her eyes softened, and for the first time in years, she felt the spark that had once made her love music too. As weeks passed, the club became the heart of the school. Students stayed after hours just to play, sing, and share stories. Some even began composing songs for fun. The walls that once echoed with scolding and silence now sang with creativity and joy. One afternoon, as the golden light streamed through the window, Principal Harris entered the room quietly. He watched the group with a proud smile. Emily sat at the piano surrounded by other kids, her laughter blending with the sound of the keys. He waited until the song ended, then clapped softly. "You've started something special here," he said. "All of you," the students smiled proudly. Mrs. Lewis stepped forward, her voice warm. "It's all thanks to Emily," she said. "She reminded us that talent can come from the quietest corners." Emily blushed, shaking her head. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was the music. It helps people listen when words don't work." Principal Harris nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe it's time we give this music something bigger," he said. "I've been thinking about organizing a charity concert, something to raise funds for new instruments and lessons for kids who can't afford them. Emily, would you be willing to perform again?" Her heart skipped a beat. The idea of another performance scared her, but the thought of helping other children learn music made her nod almost instantly. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. The word spread quickly across the school and even through town. A local newspaper picked up the story. "Little pianist inspires school to create music program." Soon, people outside the school wanted to come and hear the girl who played from her heart. As the big day approached, Emily practiced tirelessly. Sometimes late into the evening, her grandmother sitting nearby with a cup of tea watching proudly. "You're just like your mama," she would whisper, and Emily would smile through the ache in her chest. The night before the concert, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about her mother's old words. "Music isn't about being perfect, sweetheart. It's about being honest." The next morning, as she stood backstage with Mrs. Lewis and Principal Harris, her heart pounded harder than ever before. The auditorium was full, more than 100 faces waiting. But this time she wasn't scared. She wasn't alone. She placed her small hand on the piano once again, feeling its cool surface beneath her fingers, and whispered softly to herself, "This is for you, Mom." Then she took a deep breath, and the first note of the next chapter in her life began to play. ChatGPT said, "The night of the charity concert arrived like a dream. The auditorium at Willow Creek Elementary had never looked so beautiful. Rows of chairs lined the hall, each one filled with parents, teachers, neighbors, and even people from the nearby town who had heard about the little pianist who changed her school. The stage was decorated with fairy lights and paper stars made by the students. Giving the whole place a soft golden glow, Emily stood backstage, her small hands clutching the edge of her skirt. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The sounds of people chatting and laughing floated through the curtains. It was the biggest crowd she had ever seen. Beside her stood Mrs. Lewis, adjusting her glasses nervously. She had spent the entire week helping the students prepare, guiding the singers, tuning the instruments, and calming everyone's nerves, especially Emily's. Now she placed a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder. "You've got this," she said softly. "Just play the way you always do, play with your heart." Emily nodded, but her voice trembled. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Lewis smiled gently. "Then we start again. Music isn't about being perfect, it's about being brave." On the other side of the curtain, Principal Harris stepped up to the microphone. His voice echoed across the hall. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we gather for something truly special. This concert isn't just about music, it's about hope. About what happens when one small act of courage inspires a whole community." Applause filled the room, and Emily peeked through the curtain. She spotted her grandmother sitting in the front row, her hands clasped together. Her eyes sparkled with pride and love behind her. She noticed some of her classmates waving excitedly, and that made Emily's fear shrink just a little. After a few short performances by the other students, a cheerful choir song, a violin duet, and even a boy who played the drums, it was time. Mrs. Lewis gave Emily a small nod. "You're up, sweetheart." The lights dimmed, and the crowd grew quiet. Emily took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. Her small shoes clicked softly against the floor. The spotlight hit her warm and blinding. For a moment she froze, hundreds of faces staring up at her, But then she remembered Principal Harris's words, "Play like your mother is beside you." She sat down on the piano bench, straightened her back, and rested her fingers on the keys. The microphone picked up the soft sound of her breathing. The room was so silent that even the smallest sound seemed loud. Then she began to play. The first notes rose gently, like a whisper in the dark. The melody flowed through the hall, soft but powerful. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the emotion in her playing. It wasn't just a song anymore, it was a story. Each note carried pieces of her heart, the memories of her mother's laughter, the warmth of her grandmother's hugs, the fear she once felt sitting alone in that cold classroom, and the courage she found when she finally decided to play anyway. The music swelled and dipped like ocean waves, and for those few minutes time itself seemed to stop. The crowd forgot where they were, teachers, parents, even the janitor. Everyone sat still, listening to a child's soul speak through sound. Halfway through the piece, Emily glanced toward the crowd and saw Mrs. Lewis. Tears glistening on her cheeks, she smiled softly, and Emily felt something inside her ease. She wasn't the scared little girl anymore. She was a musician, a storyteller. When she reached the final verse, she played slower, letting each note linger. Her eyes closed, and for a second, she imagined her mother sitting beside her, smiling proudly, whispering, "Keep going, baby, you're doing beautifully." The last note hung in the air like a breath caught between worlds. Then it faded and silence filled the room. No one moved. It was as if the whole audience had forgotten to breathe. Then a single clap broke the silence, followed by another and another within seconds. The entire hall was on its feet. Clapping, cheering, whistling, Emily looked up, stunned. Her eyes widened as she saw the standing ovation. Rows and rows of people smiling, clapping, and even crying. Her grandmother stood with tears streaming down her face, her hand pressed to her heart. Mrs. Lewis ran up onto the stage and hugged her tightly. "You did it, Emily," she whispered. "You really did it." Principal Harris joined them, his voice thick with emotion. "That was beyond beautiful," he said, turning to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, that right there is the power of one child's courage." The audience erupted in applause again. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and for the first time Emily didn't look down or hide. She smiled, big and bright, her small body shaking with pride and relief. After the show, people came up to her, asking for autographs, hugs, and photos. Reporters from the local paper asked her how she learned to play. Emily just smiled shyly and said, "My mom taught me everything." That night, as the auditorium emptied and the lights dimmed, Emily stayed back for a moment. She ran her hand along the piano one last time. The cool surface shimmered under the fading stage lights. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. "We did it." Outside, snow had begun to fall softly, covering the world in quiet white. And as Emily walked home holding her grandmother's hand, the faint melody of her song still seemed to echo in the night air, gentle, brave, and everlasting. The next morning, sunlight spilled through Emily's window, painting her small room in gold. She woke with the sound of birds chirping outside, and for a brief moment, she thought it had all been a dream. The concert, the applause, the standing ovation. But when she turned to her desk and saw the bouquet of flowers Principal Harris had given her, she smiled. It was real, all of it. Downstairs, her grandmother was reading the local newspaper. "You're famous, sweetheart," she said with a grin. She turned the page to show Emily the front story. Little pianist melts hearts at Willow Creek charity concert. There was a photo of Emily sitting at the piano, her face glowing under the stage lights. Emily covered her mouth in surprise. "That's me," she whispered. Her grandmother laughed softly. "Yes, that's you, my dear. And look, people are already asking when your next concert will be." At school that day, things were even more surprising. As soon as Emily entered the hallway, students clapped and cheered. Some handed her small drawings of pianos and stars. Others hugged her shyly. "You were amazing." One girl said, "I want to learn the piano too." Emily didn't know what to say. Her cheeks flushed red, but her heart swelled with happiness. She wasn't the quiet, lonely girl anymore. She was someone who had inspired others. When she reached her classroom, Mrs. Lewis was waiting for her with a soft smile. "You've made this school proud," she said, "and you've made me proud too." Then she handed Emily a small gift box. Inside was a tiny silver pendant shaped like a music note. "This belonged to my sister," Mrs. Lewis said quietly. "She loved music as much as you do. I think she'd want you to have it." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching it tightly. Later that afternoon, Principal Harris called Emily to his office. Her heart raced as she walked in, but instead of a stern look, he greeted her with a big smile. "Emily, have a seat," he said behind him. Several letters and envelopes were stacked neatly on his desk. "Do you know what these are?" he asked. She shook her head. "They're from people who watched your performance," he explained. "Parents, teachers, even some folks from the local community center. They all wanted to thank you, and some of them made donations." "Donations?" Emily repeated, puzzled. He nodded proudly. "Because of your concert, we've raised enough money to start a full music scholarship program. Not just for our school, but for kids all around the district. Children who can't afford instruments or lessons will now get the chance to learn. All because of you." Emily's mouth fell open. Her eyes sparkled with disbelief. "Really?" "Really," Principal Harris said. "And the board has decided to name it after your mother, the Grace Winters Memorial Music Fund." At that, Emily froze, her mother's name spoken aloud. "Honored." It felt like magic. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." The principal smiled gently. "Don't thank me, young lady. You did this. You turned something painful into something beautiful." As Emily left the office, the school hallways felt brighter somehow. She passed the old music room, the one where it had all begun. She peeked inside and saw a few younger students sitting by the piano, trying to play simple tunes. Mrs. Lewis was helping them, smiling kindly. The sight made Emily's chest ache with joy. After school, Emily walked home through the park. The sun low and golden, kids played on the swings, and someone nearby was humming the same melody she had played at the concert. She stopped listening. The sound was imperfect but sincere, and it made her smile. When she got home, she placed the pendant Mrs. Lewis gave her beside her mother's old photo. The silver note shimmered beside her mother's smiling face. For a long moment, Emily just stood there, thinking. That night, she sat by her window with her small keyboard. The world outside was quiet, the stars blinking softly above. She began to play again, not for an audience, not for a school, but for herself and for her mom. Each note carried peace, gratitude, and a soft promise. A promise that she would keep sharing her music. No matter where life took her. Downstairs, her grandmother listened from the kitchen. Eyes wet with pride, the melody floated through the house, filling every corner with warmth. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a legacy. In that moment, Emily didn't need applause or headlines. She didn't even need a stage. All she needed were the keys beneath her fingers and the memory of a mother who taught her to play from the heart. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint echo of her song into the night. And somewhere far beyond the stars, it felt like her mother was listening, smiling and saying softly, "You did it, my little Melody." Years passed like gentle seasons, and the story of the little pianist from Willow Creek Elementary became a memory that people still spoke about with warmth and pride. What began as one frightened girl sitting alone in a classroom had grown into something far greater, a movement that changed an entire community. Emily was no longer the shy child who hid behind the piano. By the time she reached high school, her name had already become known throughout the town. She was invited to play at community events, charity gatherings, and even the annual city festival. Each time she sat at a piano, she played not for applause but for connection. Her mother's spirit still lived in every note. The Grace Winters Memorial Music Fund grew too. With Principal Harris's dedication and the town's support, it helped dozens of children across the district get access to instruments. Some learned violin, others guitar or flute, and many of them said they were inspired by the girl who played from her heart. Every Friday afternoon, Emily returned to Willow Creek Elementary to teach the younger students. The same music room where everything had started was now full of laughter and melodies. The old posters had been replaced with colorful drawings from children, pictures of pianos, stars, and music notes that read, "Thank you, Emily." Mrs. Lewis still worked there, but she had changed too. She no longer barked orders or scolded students for playing after hours. Instead, she sat quietly during lessons, guiding gently, smiling more often. Once in a while, she would lean over to Emily and whisper, "You taught me to listen again." One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves drifted past the windows, Principal Harris called Emily into his office again. He was older now, his hair grayer, but his eyes still held the same kindness. "Emily," he said, motioning for her to sit. I have news. The local university heard about your story and your music fund. They've offered you a full scholarship to study music education. Emily's jaw dropped. A scholarship? He nodded, smiling. You've earned it. You're not just a talented pianist. You're a leader. You've inspired a generation, and now it's time for you to learn even more. To bring that gift to the world. For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight with emotion. Thank you, she whispered, for believing in me. Principal Harris leaned back, his eyes soft. No, Emily, you believed in yourself first. That's what made all this possible. That evening, she told her grandmother the news. The old woman's eyes filled with tears. Your mother would be so proud, she said, hugging her tightly. You've carried her music farther than either of us ever dreamed. The night before she left for college, Emily returned to the school one last time. The halls were quiet, the air filled with that same stillness she remembered from years ago. She walked into the music room, her fingers brushing the edges of the desks. Everything looked smaller now, but the memories were huge. She sat down at the same piano where it all began. The wood was polished and worn from years of use, etched with the faint marks of countless hands that had learned after her. She smiled, pressing one soft key, letting the note echo. In the silence that followed, she could almost hear her mother's laughter, the steady voice of Principal Harris, and even Mrs. Lewis's gentle encouragement. All of them had shaped her journey. All of them had helped her grow. She began to play one last song, a quiet piece she had written herself. It wasn't sad. It was a song of beginnings and endings, of hope and gratitude. The melody swayed like autumn leaves, simple and full of love. As the final notes faded, she whispered, "Thank you for everything," and closed the lid. When she stepped outside, the sky was turning pink with sunrise. Her grandmother waited near the car, holding a thermos of hot cocoa. "Ready?" she asked. Emily smiled. "Ready?" The drive to the university took hours, but it didn't feel long. The world outside rolled by in colors of orange and gold, and as she looked out the window, Emily thought of all the people who had helped her find her voice. At the university, she quickly made friends with other music students. They were talented, confident, and passionate. But what made Emily stand out wasn't just her skill. It was her sincerity. When she played, everyone listened, even the professors paused, because they could feel what she played. Years later, when Emily graduated with honors, she didn't go on to chase fame or fortune. Instead, she came back home to Willow Creek. The school was still there, but now it had a new music building, one with her mother's name engraved on the front door. Inside, children practiced on shiny instruments donated through the scholarship fund, and Emily, now a teacher, sat beside them, guiding their hands just like her mother once did. Music, she told them, isn't about perfection, it's about remembering. It's about feeling something deeply and letting the world hear it. And every afternoon, when the sun dipped low and the halls quieted, she stayed a little longer, playing softly to herself. The same melody, the same piano, the same love. Sometimes, Mrs. Lewis, now retired, would visit, sitting quietly in the corner, smiling. Principal Harris would drop by too, leaning against the door frame, listening with that same proud look. And though her mother wasn't there in body, Emily could always feel her presence in the music, every note carrying her voice through time. The girl who once sat alone in a silent classroom had grown into a woman whose music filled the world, reminding everyone that even the smallest song, played with love, could echo forever.